In Section 3, I want to explore the life history traits of annuals and compare those with perennials. And we'll talk about how that can apply to weed management. In the second half of this section, we'll get into ecological plant succession as a natural phenomenon that drives the occurrence of different weed species in an area over time. So in this section, you'll be learning the contrast of annual versus perennial strategies for survival and the fundamentals of ecological plant succession. Upon completing this section, you should be able to describe the differences between annual and perennial weed life history and reproductive traits, diagram the chronological sequence of plant succession and vegetation communities, and then finally to explain how secondary succession affects the composition of a weed community in a crop field. What is a life history strategy? In ecological terms, it's defined as the sequence and duration of key stages in a plant's life cycle that are the product of natural selection in order to maximize its reproductive success. I like this quote by P.B. Adler, who back in 2014 published a paper, and in it he said that plants have evolved diverse life history strategies to succeed in Earth's varied environments. Some species grow quickly, produce copious seeds, and die within a few weeks. Other species grow slowly and rarely produce seeds, but live thousands of years. So he kind of nailed it, looking at those extremes about how weed life histories vary so much. And that plays a crucial role in weeds and weed management, because weeds have those essential life history strategies that enable them to infest other plants and often go undetected or become resistant to our management methods. I just want to make some relative comparisons here, just kind of some overall impressions when considering or comparing annuals versus perennials, okay? So with that first one, seedling establishment. When I think of seedling establishment in terms of annual plants, well, this is what annual plants are made for, is to establish themselves quickly from seeds, since that's their only reproductive option. So we'll just say here, in contrast, it's very rapid for annuals. And it turns out that it's relatively slow for perennials. If you've ever tried to grow a perennial plant, starting with seed, you may find that it's a lot slower process than it is with some common garden crop like squash or pumpkin or corn, sweet corn, or a field crop like corn or soybean, which come up really fast and get established quickly. Perennial plants are geared for reproduction both vegetatively and by seeds, and so their seeds aren't quite as robust in establishing a seedling in general as those of annual plants. Now, of course, there are exceptions here and there, but I'm just talking in general terms. Perennials tend to be slow to get their seedlings established from seeds. Now, when they germinate from a propagule, when an adventitious bud develops, that's a different story. But germinating from seed, from actual seed, perennials are fairly slow. What about in terms of seedling competition? So what I just talked about applies here too. Perennial seedlings are not very competitive because they are established slower. They're slower to germinate, they're slower growing in the beginning, and slower to get established. So in terms of if it's planted in amongst lots of other plants that are seeds that are germinating at the same time, the perennial's not going to be very competitive and may actually be completely crowded out if it's trying to compete with a lot of seeds of annuals. So much higher competitive ability in general for annual seedlings. In terms of regeneration potential, of course, it's greater for perennials once they're established and develop adventitious buds. Overall, greater for perennials because they have this dual capacity for both vegetative and sexual reproduction by seeds. I want to look at that in a little more detail in terms of regeneration potential as to where plants can regenerate themselves from with these different life histories. So if you look at an annual broadleaf here, for example, the lowest position on the plant from which it can regenerate itself, so to speak, are these axillary buds here where the cotyledon joins the stem. That's the lowest point on the plant from which this summer annual can regenerate itself if, for example, it were to get cut off just above those buds. Then those buds would sprout and basically replace the shoot. Now it would have two main shoots instead of one, but that's just how it would work. In terms of management, that's important to know because if you're dealing with an annual broadleaf weed, then you should know that you can cut it off as long as you cut it off somewhere below those buds in the cotyledonary axes, then it can't regenerate. It can't magically regrow back from roots or from that lower stem. It's dead. So you don't have to spend a lot of energy trying to dig the root up and all that. You can basically cut it off below those those first buds on the stem, I should say, and it just can't regenerate. With annual grasses, it's a little different because they maintain their growing point often at or just below the soil surface for several weeks after they germinate. So the growing point on this annual grass may be an inch or two below the soil. So just be aware that if you're controlling, if you know you've got annual grasses, that you can't often just chop them off right at the surface. You might have to dig a little bit to make sure you get that crown area out because that's where the growing points are, especially with young grasses. Now with biennials, they produce this basal rosette, many of them, and those leaves emerge from that central growing point that tends to be right at the soil surface. So with biennials in general, if you just cut them off a little bit below the soil surface, then they're dead. They can't regenerate. Now with simple perennials, you'll see the arrows moving down, meaning from greater depths in soil it can regenerate itself. And that's because on this crown root, you've got adventitious buds that on dandelion tend to go down for the top 1 to 2 inches usually. Sometimes they can get even a little bit lower. So it won't do just to clip the dandelion off right at the soil surface because it will readily regenerate new shoots from those adventitious buds. If you're going to waste your time digging dandelions, be sure to dig down 2 to 3 inches to get those adventitious buds. At the bottom here, we've got 2 creeping perennials, one with rhizomes and one with creeping roots. In general, rhizomes tend to stay in the top 6 inches of soil or so. So plants can regenerate from adventitious buds on those rhizomes, but it's generally within the top 6 inches of soil, depending on the species, like Johnson grass or quackgrass, for example. Commonly only in the top 6 inches. With creeping root perennials, though, the arrow goes down a little further because these adventitious buds on creeping roots can go down to some depth, greater than 6 inches, often a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet is not uncommon to find creeping roots. So among all these plants that we're looking at, the one that has the lowest point from which a shoot can regenerate are plants with creeping roots. Seed production and seed longevity are 2 very important life history strategies, and they do contrast quite a bit if you consider annuals versus perennials. Now, annuals, as we've talked about, have evolved to reproduce by seeds. That's their thing. So it would just make sense that they're very good at it and they tend to produce lots of seeds. So in general, that's the case. Weedy plants classified as annuals are greater seed producers than perennial weeds. There's some numbers here from a textbook that I pulled out. You see that here are several annuals listed at the top and their seed production capacity per plant, ranging from tens up to hundreds of thousands, sometimes even more. If you look at creeping perennials at the other end of the spectrum, you see that they're capable of much lower numbers of seeds per stem than annual plants. Biennials probably fit somewhere in the middle. Some of these tend to be on the higher side, again, because they only reproduce by seeds. They're also very good at it. So it's not uncommon to have tens or hundreds of thousand seeds produced by a biennial as well as by annuals. What about seed longevity? Kind of the same story there. Seeds of annual plants tend to be longer lived, have a greater maximum lifetime than seeds of perennials. These are some of the documented longevities for seeds of annual plants. See, some can last over 1,000 years. They find these things, archaeologists find seeds in rodent burrows and places where they excavate sites, and they can carbon date those seeds to get a rough idea of how old they are. So there's some common lamb's quarter seed that have remained alive for 1,700 years. Same for common chickweed, 600 years. But you see in general that seeds of annuals tend to have a great longevity compared to seeds of biennials, a little less, and then seeds of perennials on average are quite a bit less longevity than seeds of annuals. This last one is kind of a growth strategy or a competition strategy, if you want to think of it that way, of annuals versus perennials. You take our weedy horseweed, very important weed in Ohio, particularly of soybean fields. It's a winter annual plant that comes in and is able to coexist with the crop. It's able to germinate very early, and then when it gets established, it will elongate itself, produce these tall stems, so it basically can grow above the soybean canopy. The weeds are not unhappy in that environment because they have all the light they need for photosynthesis, and they've got their flowers up high, so when the seeds are released and the wind catches them, they'll be carried off to disperse in new environments. So it's a typical weed of annual crops that I call a coexister because it's able to get in the field and coexist along with the crop and not completely dominate the field, but just coexist. Now, if you compare that with a creeping perennial, one of the worst, like Canada thistle, the strategy there is different. Canada thistle basically comes in order to dominate by producing these creeping roots that travel throughout the soil as well as seeds to start new seedlings. It's a very different strategy because it basically comes in and grows as a solid patch each year, getting a little bigger and just growing as a solid dominant front that pushes out all other vegetation. So two very different strategies there between annuals and perennials. One of my colleagues did a study a few years ago to look at the spread of a perennial over the course of 3 years when it was just started from single plants. So what he did was went into a field and just seeded 3 little patches of hemp dogbane, a couple plants each, I think, and then he went in and mapped those very meticulously over the next 3 years to see how the shoot density and the patch itself had spread. So this is year 1, the year of establishment. Plants were established here, here, and here. And then in year 2, you can see how the plants have spread. And also the plant density in terms of number of plants per meter square has increased as well, up to 14 plants per square meter. And then by year 3, you see it's basically formed a solid patch that's now starting to spread out in all directions. This is how creeping perennials get started. And it's by that third year that it becomes critical, because if you wait another year, that patch size may double, triple, or quadruple in size depending on the species, and just gets into a logarithmic growth pattern. So catching perennial weeds, creeping perennial weeds early, is essential for effective control and management. You know, in horticulture, they have a saying about perennial plants, is that the first year you plant them, they sleep. The second year, they creep. And then the third year, they leap. I want to take a minute here and talk about perennial propagule physiology and some implications for management. We've talked about life cycles, compared annuals versus perennials. You have a good sense now as to how perennial weeds work. One thing we haven't talked about, though, is the seasonal flow that goes on inside perennial plants. I'm talking about the seasonal flow of carbohydrates. It's constantly shipping carbohydrates either down into its roots or vegetative propagules, or from those vegetative propagules up into the rest of the plant. So the key is knowing when this flow occurs and in what direction it occurs at different times of the year or growth stages. So this has direct implications for management of perennial weeds. It's very important. So there are two things I want to talk about with regard to managing perennial weeds. The first is that defoliation triggers adventitious bud development. So with this Canada thistle plant shown in the picture here, you know that it's got creeping roots underneath with adventitious buds. If you were to go in and just chop that shoot off, pull it off, cut it off, burn it off with a herbicide or with fire, that has a physiological effect on the rest of the plant that stimulates those adventitious buds on the roots underneath to sprout. So you may come back after you destroy that initial shoot, come back several weeks later and find now you've got 3 brand new ones that took its place. Very common with perennial weeds, especially those with creeping roots. So the more you defoliate it, the more shoots are produced as those adventitious buds are stimulated to sprout. There are a couple of things that cause this to happen. The first thing is when you cut that shoot off, you cut off the supply of auxin. Auxin is the hormone that exerts apical dominance over the rest of the buds on that shoot, so it keeps them dormant as long as the apical meristem is intact, because it's releasing auxin that flows through the rest of the plant to keep those buds dormant. Also, these leaves are producing sugar and sending it down to the rest of the plant. And when you cut the shoot off, you also cut off the sucrose supply. So those two things together, this sudden cutoff of auxin when you remove the shoot, and this sudden removal of the sucrose supply, is what triggers those adventitious buds to germinate. It's a normal physiological response that just tells the plant that it needs to replace the shoot it just lost. Okay, the second thing I wanted you to know about these perennial weeds is about this seasonal flow of carbohydrates that are going up and down into and out of the vegetative propagules, which really serve as the storage organs for a lot of these creeping perennial weeds. Well, this is what the seasonal flow of carbohydrates looks like on the seasonal scale. You see winter, spring, summer, fall, and then back to winter. If you look at the size of the plant here, or the plant part, well, during the winter, let's say we have a plant with rhizomes. Well, obviously there's not going to be any growth occurring during the winter. It's going to be too cold, so the plant is dormant. The rhizome overwinters full of carbohydrates that it stored up the previous fall. It's in a overwintering state, packed full of carbohydrates, because as soon as the temperature warms up, it will use those carbohydrates to build new shoots and roots as it sprouts. So in the spring, then, it warms up. The plant will sprout from adventitious buds there on the node, and it will be drawing out carbohydrate from that rhizome to build those new shoots and roots. Okay, and then in the summer, the plant continues to grow, gets self-sufficient, no longer needs to use what's in the rhizome, but now is producing plenty of photosynthate, and that photosynthate is being sent down to the rest of the plant. Okay, in the fall, then, now you probably have many mature leaves, maybe even a seed head that the plant has produced. And now almost all of the carbohydrates it's producing in the leaves through photosynthesis are being shipped down to replenish and rebuild that rhizome. So after the killing frost comes, the rhizome will be there nice and plump and dormant in the soil again to overwinter. So the key difference here is that in the spring, carbohydrate movement is up. In other words, it's coming from the rhizome up to the rest of the plant. So carbohydrates being drawn out of that vegetative propagule, the rhizome in this case, to feed the rest of the plant. In the fall, or at this more advanced stage of growth after reproduction has occurred, the plant starts sending carbohydrate back down into the rhizome where it's going to be stored for overwintering. So again, at the early stage of growth, or in the spring, carbohydrates are moving up. In late summer, early fall, carbohydrates kind of reverse direction and start to move down back into the vegetative propagules. So how can we use that knowledge for management? I guess the answer would be what type of management do you want to use? So if you're an organic grower, for example, and you can't use herbicides, what are the options here for control? Well, if you're going to use mechanical methods like tillage or repeated mowing or something like that, you can get rid of creeping perennials as long as you're cognizant of the fact that you don't want to be spreading root pieces or rhizome pieces all over the farm. So you have to be very careful about cleaning your tillage equipment. Repeated mowing also is a possibility. And if you're going to do those types of operations, the best time to do them is in this part of the curve here. You want to do it when carbohydrates are moving up, because when you chop those leaves off with mowing or tillage, then it will try to re-sprout, re-grow again. If you chop that one off, it will try to re-sprout, regrow again, and eventually it can deplete all of the carbohydrates from that vegetative propagule. It may take 3, 4, 5, 6 times of repeated mowing or tillage to do that, but if you're consistent and stay with it and prevent it from producing mature leaves, then you can do some good with repeated mowing or tillage during that vegetative growth stage. Essentially, you're causing it to drain out its carbohydrates faster and faster every time you mow it. Okay, the alternative to that, then, if you can use chemicals, you want to apply a chemical when it's going to be most effective. And for creeping perennial, that's always when the carbohydrate flow is moving down. Using herbicides like Roundup, for example, that are highly systemic, meaning they will translocate throughout the plant. Those should be applied when plants are in this growth stage in late summer, early fall typically, to get maximum translocation down into the vegetative propagules. It's the propagules you really want to kill. That's the important part. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is to see weeds come up in the spring, get all excited, go down to their local store, buy a container of Roundup, come back and spray them when they're in this stage. What happens when you spray herbicides in that stage is it'll kill the top part of the plant, but not the bottom part. Why? Because all the carbohydrates are flowing up, and the herbicide tends to flow wherever the carbohydrates flow. So just spraying the top part of the plant is only going to kill the top part of the plant if you spray it when the plant's small in the spring like this. Again, I'm talking only about creeping perennials here. All right, so you'll do yourself a lot better job of weed management if you wait till your perennial weed is in the reproductive stage. Anytime at the flower bud stage or later works great, because we know that if it's in that reproductive stage or later, that the carbohydrate flow is going to be downward, so that your Roundup or whatever your herbicide is will be translocated down into those creeping roots or rhizomes. Here's a couple of common pokeweed plants. The one on the left is untreated. The one on the right was a mature plant that had seeds on it already that I treated with Roundup 10 days earlier. And you can see how well that the herbicide has moved down with the flow of carbohydrates. This was in the late summer when the carbohydrate flow was down. I knew it would be going down because the plant had mature fruit on it already. And remember, anytime in the flower bud stage or later is good for getting that downward flow of carbohydrates. Now you can see in this cross section of the root that the treated root is already showing the effects of Roundup throughout the system there. So a great job of translocation down from the leaves into that root when applied at the right stage of growth.